It was the early morning of May 1st, 1960, and across the Soviet Union, the sky was calm, wide, and endless. But somewhere above the clouds, a single mysterious object appeared on the radar screens of Soviet air defense stations. The operators were startled. It was flying impossibly high, far above any bomber or reconnaissance plane they had ever tracked. The radar pings grew stronger, showing steady movement across forbidden zones. Confusion filled the command room. Was it a weather balloon? A comet? Or something more deliberate? None of their aircraft could reach that altitude, and yet the object continued its path, slicing through the upper atmosphere with silent confidence. Far above, almost touching the edge of space, the American U-2 spy plane glided forward. Its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, focused on his instruments, unaware that below him, a storm of Soviet anger was already rising. For years, the U-2 program had been one of the deepest secrets of the Cold War. It was created for one reason: to look down on the Soviet Union from a height where no interceptor or missile could touch it. The aircraft was sleek, fragile-looking, and as light as possible, built to soar higher than 70,000 feet. From there, its cameras could see entire air bases, rocket sites, and cities in astonishing detail. Each photograph sent back to Washington was worth more than gold. It gave the United States knowledge of Soviet weapons that could change the balance of power. The missions began from remote airfields in places like Turkey and Pakistan, always under the cover of darkness. Every flight was a dance with danger. One mistake could mean capture or worse, war. But until that May morning in 1960, no U-2 had ever failed to return home safely. Inside the Kremlin, reports of strange high-altitude intrusions had been coming in for years. Soviet radar operators complained that something invisible to the eye but sharp on their screens moved regularly across their land. Pilots scrambled to intercept, but their aircraft stalled long before reaching such heights. It was an insult that gnawed at Soviet pride. Khrushchev, who had replaced Stalin, could not bear the thought that American planes were flying freely above his motherland. He wanted proof, revenge, and most of all, a victory to show his people. Soviet engineers began working in deep secrecy, creating new weapons that could strike where no aircraft could fly. The answer came in the form of the SA-2 surface-to-air missile, a weapon capable of reaching the stratosphere. As tests succeeded, confidence grew. Khrushchev waited patiently for the day he could show the Americans that the age of impunity was over. At dawn on that fateful day, Francis Gary Powers prepared for his mission from a secret airbase in Pakistan. He knew the risks, but he had flown many times before. His orders were to cross the Soviet Union from south to north, capturing every military installation of importance. As his U-2 climbed higher, the earth below turned pale blue, almost curved, as if he were touching the edge of space. The plane glided silently, invisible to ordinary eyes, but deep below, Soviet radar had already locked onto him. Command posts buzzed with tension. Near the city of Sverdlovsk, the order was finally given. Soviet missile operators launched the new SA-2s into the sky. The rockets climbed higher and faster, guided by radar beams. One found its mark. The explosion shattered the silence at 70,000 feet. Powers' aircraft broke apart, and the age of secrecy ended in fire and smoke. When the wreckage of the U-2 began to fall from the sky, the Soviet countryside came alive with panic and curiosity. Farmers and soldiers rushed toward the crash site, expecting nothing more than scattered metal. But as they arrived, they saw the impossible. Parts of the aircraft were nearly intact, and tangled among the debris was a parachute. Francis Gary Powers had survived. He was bruised, disoriented, and stunned that he was still alive. Within minutes, he was surrounded by armed soldiers. His secret mission, his camera equipment, even his maps were all exposed to the enemy. By the time Moscow received the report, the excitement inside the Kremlin was electric. Khrushchev could hardly believe his luck. The Americans had finally been caught red-handed. For years, they had denied any intrusion into Soviet airspace, but now he had the evidence: a live pilot, a functioning camera, and a plane that told its own story. In Washington, the reaction was chaos. When Powers failed to check in at his return point, the CIA scrambled to create a cover story. They announced that a weather research plane had gone missing over Turkey and may have drifted off course. It was a weak attempt, one born of panic rather than strategy. Khrushchev, knowing the truth, waited patiently for the Americans to trap themselves in their own lie. Days later, he stepped before the Soviet parliament and made his announcement. A spy plane, he said, had been shot down deep inside Soviet territory, and the pilot was alive. The world gasped. The United States tried to hold its line, but then Khrushchev revealed everything: the photos, the equipment, and finally, Powers himself. The American government stood humiliated before the world, exposed in a game it thought it controlled. For the Soviet people, the capture of Powers was more than a military victory. It was a matter of pride. Newspapers printed his photo on every front page, labeling him the American spy who thought he could touch the sky. His trial was broadcast across the nation. Powers stood in a courtroom surrounded by Soviet judges, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling notes. He explained his orders, his mission, and his aircraft, while Soviet officials nodded triumphantly. Khrushchev made sure every sentence of that trial was used as propaganda, showing the world that the USSR could defend its skies. Yet behind the celebration, Soviet scientists were hard at work studying the remains of the U-2. Its technology was decades ahead in some areas, and the information they gained from it would influence their own aircraft designs for years to come. In the United States, the scandal ripped through the government like a storm. President Eisenhower faced fierce criticism from allies and adversaries alike. The upcoming Paris Peace Summit, which was meant to ease Cold War tensions, collapsed overnight. Khrushchev arrived with fury, denouncing the Americans in front of the world and walking out of the meeting. The hopes of peace turned into renewed hostility. Intelligence agencies tightened their grip on secrecy, and the skies became a silent battlefield once again. Powers, meanwhile, sat in a Soviet prison, unsure if he would ever see home again. His name became a symbol of both bravery and embarrassment. To some, he was a soldier caught in duty. To others, he was the spark that reignited the Cold War flame. The world had seen how one flight could change the balance between two superpowers. As the months passed, the tension between Washington and Moscow hardened like steel. The U-2 incident had left scars that diplomacy could not heal. Inside CIA headquarters, officials quietly reviewed every operation that had once seemed untouchable. Every flight, every radio code, every pilot's route was questioned. The Soviets had proven their skies were no longer vulnerable. Across the ocean, Khrushchev used his triumph to strengthen his grip on power. The people cheered him as the man who had humbled the Americans. Yet behind the closed doors of the Kremlin, he was calculating. The U-2's secrets had given Soviet engineers a glimpse into the West's technological power and its limits. Both sides now raced to dominate the heavens, not just with planes, but with rockets and satellites. The Cold War had shifted from the airfields to the stars, and each nation vowed never to be caught off guard again. Francis Gary Powers remained a pawn in this deadly game. In his small prison cell, he was treated neither as a hero nor as a criminal, but as a message. Every question he answered, every confession he signed, was another weapon in the Soviets' propaganda war. He was interrogated daily, sometimes gently, sometimes not. The KGB wanted every detail: the altitude, the base, the technology, the training. Powers knew that one wrong word could be twisted into another international headline. Meanwhile, in America, his family lived under the weight of silence. They received letters, carefully censored, filled with hope and fear. To them, he was not just a captured pilot. He was a husband, a father, and a man trapped in the shadow of history. The CIA watched from afar, helpless to act. To rescue him was impossible. To forget him was unthinkable. 2 years later, a quiet deal began to take shape in the fog of espionage. Behind the walls of diplomacy, both nations understood that endless hostility served no one. In 1962, on a cold February morning, the world witnessed an extraordinary scene on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. On one side stood Francis Gary Powers, thin but alive. On the other side stood Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy captured years earlier by the Americans. Cameras clicked, and in a brief, silent exchange, both men walked back to their countries. The swap was over in minutes, but its meaning would last for decades. It reminded the world that even in the darkest years of the Cold War, reason could still find a voice. Powers returned home to applause, suspicion, and questions. Some called him a hero. Others whispered that he had talked too much. Years later, long after the Cold War's fires had cooled, historians would look back on the U-2 incident as one of the defining moments of the 20th century. It revealed how fragile peace truly was when pride and fear ruled nations. The flight that was meant to gather intelligence instead exposed the limits of secrecy. Powers lived quietly after his release, haunted by the weight of the mission that had gone wrong. He spoke rarely of his time in captivity, choosing instead to live a humble life until his death in 1977. But his story, one of duty, courage, and miscalculation, remained etched into the legacy of the Cold War. The skies he once flew through were no longer a battlefield, but the memory of that single flight still whispered a warning. Even the smallest act can ignite the world.